President Lee Jae Myung and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping are sitting down for their second summit over in Beijing on this Monday, some 2 months after their first face-to-face here in South Korea last November. With more press perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Monday, January 5th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we touch upon South Korea's diplomatic agenda in neighboring China as President Lee Jae Myung and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping meet for yet another summit today. For more on this, I have freelance journalist Yang Chien-Hao from Taiwan here in the studio. Chien-Hao, welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having me here.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, it's great to have you here.
Hello and Happy New Year.
Right, Happy New Year to you too, Chien-Hao. President Lee Jae Myung and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, as I mentioned in the short clip, are meeting for their second summit over in Beijing on this Monday. First then, what makes this second meeting so significant?
So from President Lee Jae Myung's perspective, to strengthening the ties between South Korea and China carries several clear benefits. First, if China takes a more friendly approach or stance towards South Korea, there is a strong possibility that North Korea could also respond with goodwill, which could help advance the peace and stability in the Northeastern Asia region. And second, China's vast market remains a key target for South Korea as it looks to further expand its export-driven economy. And the third, when it comes to supply chains, China plays a very critical role, and that includes essential materials such as urea and rare earth elements and various metals. Many resources needed for South Korea's semiconductor industry and transportation sector still depend heavily on imports from China till now. And in fact, among 300 product categories for which South Korea relies on imports for more than 90% of the domestic demand, the majority are sourced from China. And maintaining stable relations with Beijing helps to ensure the steady supply of these materials, preventing disruptions that could destabilize the economy and society. And today we also saw that President Lee traveling to China alongside with the heads of South Korea's major chaebols. We can see that Samsung's Lee Jae-yong and SK Group's Che Tae-won, Hyundai's Chung Hee-young and LG's Gu Guangmo, those presidents from all of these enterprises, together they attended the Korea and China Economic Forum held for the first time in 8 years. And President Lee went on to say that there is a saying that you need a boat to cross the water, and it is the people who decide whether to set sail. So he was asking to launch the ship of Korea and China cooperation, and the Korean government will also work with the Chinese government to create the necessary conditions. And he even added that he hopes both of the countries can raise the sails of trade, people-to-people exchanges, and cultural cooperation and cross the winds and waves of the Yellow Sea together. I think we just have a report in the last hour. You can see President Lee's showing his eagerness seeking economic cooperation with China.
Right. And Stephen, speaking to China's Central Television ahead of his state visit, President Lee Jae Myung linked the objective of his trip to addressing past misunderstandings and advancing bilateral ties to a new level. What do you suppose are the prospects of such intentions?
The first sign, I think, is just that there was a willingness on both sides to carry out a state visit, of Lee to host, Xi to host Lee. Their two names sound quite similar to ignorant Western ears like mine. And Lee decided that this was a worthwhile thing to go ahead with. And also, I just think Lee chose his words quite carefully. I think it's a skilled diplomatic maneuver to refer to friction as being caused by misunderstandings and not caused by the two sides holding fundamentally different positions. Kind of sets the stage for progress in these talks, because what better way to clear up misunderstandings than to have these kinds of in-person meetings. I mean, I don't know exactly how frank or how casual the two leaders will be when they interact, but this will be a chance to establish some kind of personal rapport, some kind of personal connection. In comments earlier today, Lee mentioned that he visited Beijing a number of times when he was mayor of Seongnam, when the whole experience was bringing back some kind of positive memories for him. That's all encouraging. And another thing that both leaders have said, going back to their encounter in Gyeongju we're at that weird part of the year where we have to refer to things that happened like a month ago as last year. Like, so last November was about a month or two ago. When they met at the APEC Forum, they both referred to the two countries as inseparable. And more specifically, they both highlighted the kind of their shared economic legacies, that these are two countries that came from being primarily low income, primarily agrarian, to becoming advanced manufacturers with very large middle classes, and that they both played a kind of complementary role in that. That for South Korea, having China as a very large export market was very beneficial, and going back and forth, like China exports plenty of consumer goods to Korea. China has benefited technologically from cooperation and from assistance from Korea. And so they're saying kind of all the right notes, so that I would say that the prospects for improvement in these areas is pretty promising. Earlier today, Lee mentioned that the bilateral trade between the two countries has been plateaued at like roughly $300 billion annually for a number of years. And so that his team's focus on this trip is finding ways to get that number up. Just a few hours ago at a business forum, I think he highlighted beauty products and video games and a number of other areas where he felt like there's room for additional cooperation. He mentioned cultural exchanges in the areas of sports and of popular culture as other ways that the two sides can get closer together. So I think we can conclude that we're seeing some very positive signaling from both sides, and pretty soon the more kind of detailed work will begin as the two teams sit down and try to figure out the details of how to bring that cooperation ahead.
Right indeed. And beyond trade and cultural exchanges, Chien-Hao, quite a number of pundits believe that high on South Korea's agenda this time around is also Beijing's potential assistance in approaching Pyongyang. What are the prospects of such partnership between Seoul and Beijing to engage Pyongyang, do you think?
In fact, ever since the democratization of South Korea in 1987, each president, no matter who he or she is, has tried to build friendly ties with China, seeking Beijing authority as a key to open the door to North Korea. And that idea dates back to Notaeul era, and in 1992, South Korea also cut the diplomatic ties with Taiwan and formally established the relations with China. And even former President Yoon Suk-yeol, who had criticized China in the past, took a different approach once he was in office. During his presidency, he adopted a more cautious and more restrained tone toward the Beijing authority. Yoon's first national security advisor, Kim Sung-han, he once told us during the briefing, saying that the administration never gave up on the idea that improving relations with China could help bring about change in North Korea. And after President Lee Jae Myung took office last year, South Korea sent more goodwill signals to the north. We saw like Seoul voluntarily lift the loudspeaker broadcast along the border area, and also say it does not insist on unification by absorption, but it is willing to respect North Korea's position and authority. So far, however, we can see that till now, Pyongyang authority has not responded positively to President Lee's gestures. And now, as President Lee meets with President Xi, it is likely he is once again hoping to use China as a channel or as a tool to influence North Korea. But that has become much difficult, much harder to do. As we mentioned last week on the program here, ties between China and South Korea have been like strained over the THAAD missile defense issues in 2016, and this year marks nearly a decade of that tension. And China has yet to officially lift the restrictions on South Koreans' movies, TV shows, TV contents, and concerts. So-called the Korean ban is still in place. And so today, if South Korea want to change North Korea it may first have to change China, and that task, that mission is way more difficult now.
Right, and against this backdrop, Stephen, there are quite a number of people who claim that South Korea's plan to build nuclear-powered submarines may serve to be a stumbling block of sorts with regard to its ties with China. What have you been hearing on the ground?
It's a very interesting question because I remember I was quite surprised when in Gyeongju, President Lee mentioned when he was imploring U.S. President Trump for permission to build these submarines, he specifically mentioned that it would allow South Korea to more effectively track North Korean and Chinese vessels in the environs of the Korean Peninsula. And he said this just before, like a few days before his meeting with Xi. And as far as we know, China hasn't carried out any kind of like open or public pushback to that. And, you know, today's summit appears to be going ahead quite cordially. But, you know, just as Chien-Hao laid out there quite comprehensively, China has this quite long history of, you know, what we call economic coercion, of using trade and other kinds of economic measures to sort of induce countries towards behavior that they prefer and to pressure countries away from behavior that they do not prefer. And it's a bit hard to parse this because the Korean ban, the restrictions on cultural activities and all the rest that Chien-Hao was referring to, like, it's all very kind of unofficial. It's all, you know, the Beijing government like does not, their general practices do not come out and to make like explicit statements that they are doing this. It's just, you know, there are contracts that do not go through. There are visas that do not get approved. You know, I remember when there was a kind of unofficial ban on groups of Chinese tourists coming to South Korea. All of a sudden, the streets of Myeongdong were a lot quieter than they had been, and a lot of retailers were suffering. That was another thing that was never like explained explicitly, but in a positive sign that appears to have. There's a lot more Chinese visitors coming here now, so that's a kind of indication of a thaw. So we won't really know. The THAAD issue is still unresolved. It's not as though South Korea has walked away from it. It's still functioning. So, you know, whether or not this decision to build nuclear power submarines will engender a similar kind of campaign of pressure, we don't know. But one thing we can say for sure is that while Lee's team are in Beijing, they will do everything they can to explain this to the Chinese side as best they can and as clearly and as delicately as they can, and try to avoid that kind of economic scenario.
Right. Meanwhile, Chien-Hao, speaking as a journalist from Taiwan, what issues might be of interest to Taiwan with regard to this latest summit between South Korea and China?
Indeed, even before the visit of President Lee to Beijing, media in Taiwan were already paying very close attention to the interview he gave to the state-run Chinese Central Television, CCTV, which we just discussed, where he said that he respects the one China policy. And in fact, many world leaders, including those in Japan, have made similar statements in the past. But what's worth noting, however, is that many Chinese media outlets and even Chinese netizens, they tend to interpret such remarks as the leaders supporting unification. But in reality, understanding and respecting something is very different from actually accepting it. And these are two very different concepts. And probably after our show, President Lee is going to set to hold the summit with President Xi Jinping in Beijing. And what Taiwanese media are watching closely is whether China will press the South Korea leader to take a more stronger or more explicit position on the Taiwan issue. And this comes especially after the shocking news over the weekend that the Venezuela president, Nicolas Maduro, was captured by the United States troops. Venezuela has long been one of China's most frequently cited allies, friend, and seeing developments like this, I think President Xi himself is likely to be quite uneasy. And turning to the economic angle, in another aspect, China and Taiwan share the same language, and because Beijing has always been seeking to unify, to have like unification with Taiwan, it has historically offered a wide range of economic incentives to attract those Taiwanese businessmen or companies to invest or to stay in China doing business. But as the wages in China have risen and the political atmosphere has become really tense. It is no longer as easy as for Taiwanese companies to set up factories or doing business there. And as a result, over the past decade, we can see that many of the Taiwanese businessmen and companies, they have been withdrawn China. So the key question now is, between South Korea and China, especially when it comes to cooperate investment, what concrete agreements will come out of this relationship, and will they actually help South Korea expand its exports?
Right, and while we await for details of this latest summit between South Korea and China, Stephen, some observers have made note of the timing of the second summit between South Korea and China, as it comes ahead of talks planned between South Korea and Japan. What are your thoughts?
My first thought is I wish that Seoul would confirm the timing of this summit with Japan. It's not confirmed yet, and just for personal, selfish reasons, as somebody who covers Korea-Japan relations, if they could announce when this is going to take place, that would be helpful, and it would help us as we discuss this today, so we could give it a little more certainty. I would say it's possible that Lee perhaps wanted to go to China first, just because China is economically a much bigger country and a much more important trading partner for Korea, and he might want to make a kind of gesture of wanting to hear out the Chinese side before going to Japan. Just for context, Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi recently made some comments that sparked a kind of something of a crisis in Beijing-Tokyo relations, where she implied that Japan would defend Taiwan in the case of a military operation by China. So Lee, I imagine, in line with his pragmatic foreign policy, with his foreign policy that he has described as being motivated by wishing to maximize the South Korean national interest, I imagine he doesn't want to get into that. He doesn't want to take a position. Just before embarking on his current trip to Beijing, he said that he respects the One China principle and that he does not wish to cause any unnecessary, any further misunderstandings there. So. I think Lee is a very skilled politician, as I've said on these airwaves more than once. Just observing him, I feel like he has he has a knack for how to deliver messages and how to kind of satisfy constituents. You know, he was a popular mayor and a popular governor before he became president. So this seems to me like something that he probably will be able to manage his messaging in a way that he can get his point across to both sides in a way that is kind of mutually pleasing. If he does go to Japan next week, I think that will be a trip that will kind of carry less baggage, just because we're already on a kind of, I don't know what the idiom I'm looking for, borrowed times, when you have time, like kind of unexpected goodwill between Japan and China. Lee has a long history of being kind of strident when it comes to Japan, and feeling as though Japan was not a reliable partner and was not sufficiently contritious, had not shown enough contrition for the 1910 to 1945 occupation of Korea. And Takaichi, for her side, has a reputation as kind of hawkish, but the two leaders have been very cordial so far. They've gotten along very well. So if Lee does go to Japan next week, that will be a kind of a bonus, a kind of a sign of like unexpectedly fruitful ties. So I think Lee will probably, while he's in Beijing, he will be pursuing this trip as much more with having a lot more riding on it, a lot more economic and business interests at stake. So I think he's probably focused on that for now, and he's gonna deal with Japan when he gets home.
Right, and keeping in mind what Steven has just said, then, Chien-Hao, if I were to ask you to highlight perhaps three main objectives of the Lee Jae Myung administration, given its latest summit, latest visit to China, what would you choose to highlight?
If I were to rank the priorities, I would put them in this order, in the following order. First, maintaining the supply chain stability, because South Korea has not yet broken free from its dependence on China. And if Beijing were to take the retaliatory measures in the future, such as restricting the export of certain raw materials to South Korea, that could seriously disrupt the economic and society order. We've already seen this before. The urea shortage in the past caused major chaos in the truck transportation nationwide. And that's a clear example of how vulnerable the system can be. And that had happened during President Moon Jae-in and President Yoon Suk-yeol's period. And keeping the supply chain stable is also crucial to ensuring that semiconductor giants such as Samsung and SK Hynix can continue to grow and drive South Korea's overall economy. And second, restoring the cultural exchange and creating a more friendly atmosphere between South Korea and China. Only when the so-called Korean ban is released, can we say the bilateral relations are really back to normal officially. And without that, it's very difficult to move forward with border cooperation in other areas. And the third one will be the economic cooperation, specifically helping South Korea to expand its exports to China. And the fourth, using the improved relations with China as a way to influence the change in North Korea. And at this stage, I think aside from the first item, supply chain stability, the other three items I mentioned will be extremely difficult to achieve in the short term. We all understand that ties, cooperations, interactions between South Korea and China are really important. But speaking as someone from Taiwan, I would still stress this. When dealing with China, every step needs to be taken with great caution, and dependence on China should be reduced as much as possible.
Right, and speaking about China, Stephen, then what are the three potential things that the Xi Jinping administration may be seeking to secure given its latest summit with South Korea?
Before I answer that, I just want to say that I'm speculating and I have no special knowledge as to what Xi's plan is. There's a whole industry of China people who are a lot smarter than me who parse these things. These are just my thoughts as to what they might be seeking. The first one is as it pertains to rare earths. I mean, China holds a lot of leverage. As Chien-Hao laid out earlier, South Korea relies on imports from China for a lot of these things. Seeing as South Korea as a U.S. ally, I wonder if Xi's team might be looking to set some kind of guidelines as to we will continue to supply with these rare earths, but we want to know how you're going to use them. Is this all just strictly for commercial purposes, or do you plan to use share these with the U.S. in some ways? Are these going toward military cooperation? Is this for military uses? And is the U.S. potentially involved in those military uses? I think they would talk about that. The second one is maybe the most important. I wonder if Xi will try to use his leverage to get access to more South Korean semiconductor technology. A massive variable in the world nowadays is that China has to kind of modify its behavior and kind of keep some of its aggression in check because it still relies on imports of the most advanced semiconductors, and it needs those for its economy. And a really important goal of the Xi administration is to get its own chip-making capabilities up to the point where it no longer needs to rely on imports, and South Korea is a key player in that sector. So I wonder if Xi might be saying something like, well, maybe you could have your best etching or whatever it happens to be technicians come over here and carry out some training for our local people and all the rest like that. And just the last one, the third one would be, I wonder if they might just talk about messaging on Taiwan, and they might say, we want you to come out with, perhaps a carefully worded statement, but some kind of public gesture that you are not leaning towards supporting Taiwanese independence in any way, that you are, either you are staying out of it or you are kind of taking our side a little bit. That's a very delicate issue, and there's a lot of nuance there, but that's something that at least I think Xi might be looking to impart on the South Korean side.
Right, I suppose we'll find out within the next 24 hours then after this second summit between the two leaders. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
And Chien-Hao, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow, that is Tuesday, with yet another panel session on diplomacy. Join us then.